Hello everyone! Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. Story 1. The breathing cargo. The manifest said furniture. But Danny could hear something moving in the trailer. He had picked up the load from a warehouse in Portland 3 days ago, destined for a small town in eastern Montana that he had never heard of before. The pay was exceptional, almost twice what he normally made for a cross-country haul, and the dispatcher had been oddly insistent that he not open the trailer under any circumstances until delivery. Danny had been driving trucks for 23 years, and he knew better than to ask too many questions about cargo that paid this well. But now, parked at a rest stop somewhere in Idaho at 3 a.m, he sat in his cab listening to sounds that furniture should not make. At first, he had dismissed it as his imagination, the product of too many hours on the road and not enough sleep. The human mind does strange things when exhausted, conjuring sounds and images from nothing but shadows and silence. But the sounds had grown more distinct over the past few hours. There was a rhythm to them, a slow and steady pattern that reminded him uncomfortably of breathing. He told himself it was the trailer expanding and contracting with temperature changes, metal groaning against metal as the night air cooled the steel. Yet the explanation felt hollow even as he thought it, because the sounds were too organic, too deliberate. They rose and fell with a cadence that seemed almost alive. Danny climbed down from his cab, his boots crunching on the gravel of the parking lot. The rest stop was nearly empty, just his truck and a small sedan parked far away near the restrooms. The sodium lights cast an orange glow over everything, making the scene feel surreal and dreamlike. He walked slowly toward the back of his trailer, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sounds grew louder as he approached, and now he could hear something else beneath the breathing. A wet, sliding sound like something large and slick moving against the interior walls of the trailer. His hand trembled as he reached for the lock on the trailer doors. The company had given him a special key, heavy and old-fashioned, made of brass that had turned green with age. Before he could insert the key, his phone rang, the sudden sound making him jump violently. He fumbled it out of his pocket, his heart hammering against his ribs. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway, grateful for any distraction from what he was about to do. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, a woman's voice that sounded like it belonged to someone reading from a script. She told him that she was calling from the shipping company, that there had been a concern about his route, that he needed to avoid opening the trailer until he reached his destination. Danny asked her how she knew he was at the trailer doors, how she knew what he was about to do. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when the woman spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming deeper and more urgent. She told him that the cargo was temperature sensitive, that exposure to outside air could ruin it completely, that he would be liable for damages worth more than he could ever repay. He backed away from the trailer, the phone still pressed to his ear, and as he did, the breathing sound stopped suddenly, replaced by an absolute and total silence that was somehow even more frightening. The woman on the phone seemed to sense his fear, and her voice became soothing, almost hypnotic. She assured him that everything was fine, that he just needed to get back on the road and complete his delivery, that there were only 8 more hours of driving ahead of him. Danny wanted to refuse, wanted to call the police, wanted to abandon the truck right there in the parking lot and never look back. But he thought about the money, about the bills piling up at home, about his daughter's college tuition that was due next month. He thought about all the times he had transported cargo without asking questions, all the loads that had seemed slightly off but had turned out to be nothing more than his imagination running wild. He got back in his cab and started the engine, pulling out of the rest stop and back onto the dark highway. The breathing sounds resumed almost immediately, and now they seemed to be keeping time with his own breath, matching his rhythm exactly. He turned up the radio trying to drown out the sounds, but they seemed to cut through every song. every advertisement, every weather report. Miles passed beneath his wheels, the white lines on the highway blurring together in his exhaustion. He began to notice that the truck was handling differently, as if the weight in the trailer was shifting, moving from side to side as he navigated curves. The cargo straps should have prevented any movement, but something back there was definitely not staying still. Dawn was just beginning to break when he finally saw the exit sign for the town on his delivery manifest. The place was even smaller than he had imagined. Just a handful of buildings clustered around a single intersection, surrounded by vast expanses of wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. The delivery address took him down a dirt road that led away from the town, toward a large metal building that sat alone in the middle of a field. There were no markings on the building, no signs indicating what it might be used for. Several people were waiting outside, dressed in white coveralls that reminded Danny of hazmat suits. They waved him forward, directing him to back his trailer up to a loading dock. As soon as he put the truck in park, the people in coveralls swarmed around his trailer. They worked with incredible speed and efficiency, unlocking the doors and disappearing inside before Danny could even climb down from his cab. He stood by his truck watching them work, trying to see what was inside the trailer, but they had positioned themselves to block his view, forming a human wall between him and whatever cargo he had been carrying. One of them approached him with a clipboard and a thick envelope. The man's face was covered by a respirator mask, his eyes hidden behind dark goggles. He thrust the clipboard at Danny, indicating where he should sign. Danny asked what was in the trailer, what he had been transporting across 3 states. The man did not answer, just tapped the clipboard impatiently. Danny signed the papers, his hand moving almost automatically, and accepted the envelope of cash. It was thicker than he had expected, and when he looked inside, he saw that it contained almost 3 times what they had originally promised him. The man in the coveralls leaned close, his voice muffled by the mask, and told Danny that he had done good work, that they might have another job for him next month. Then he handed Danny a business card with nothing on it but a phone number printed in small black letters. The man told him to forget what he had heard during the drive, to forget this place, to forget everything except that phone number. There were more jobs available, he said, for drivers who knew how to keep their mouths shut and their questions to themselves. Danny drove away from that place as fast as he could, his empty trailer bouncing on the rutted dirt road. He told himself that he would throw away the business card, that he would never take another job from that company, that the money was not worth the fear that still made his hands shake on the steering wheel. But even as he thought these things, he knew he was lying to himself, because in his rearview mirror, he could see the building growing smaller in the distance, and inside that building, he could hear the breathing starting again, even though he was now hundreds of yards away. The sound followed him all the way back to the highway, and even now, weeks later, he sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night, convinced that he can still hear it. That wet and rhythmic breathing that sounds almost but not quite human, coming from somewhere in the darkness of his bedroom. Story 2. The Hitchhiker Who Wasn't There. Sarah had a strict policy about hitchhikers. She never picked them up, no matter how desperate they looked, no matter what the weather was like, no matter how far they were from the nearest town. She had been driving long-haul routes for 8 years, and she had heard too many stories from other truckers about hitchhikers who turned out to be thieves or worse. But on that rainy October night, somewhere along a lonely stretch of Highway 50 in Nevada, she broke her own rule. The figure had appeared suddenly at the side of the road, illuminated by her headlights for just a moment before being swallowed again by darkness and rain. It was a woman. Sarah was certain of that, wearing what looked like a white dress that clung to her thin frame, soaked through by the downpour. The woman was not thumbing for a ride or holding up a sign. She simply stood there perfectly still, staring directly at Sarah's approaching truck, with an expression that Sarah could not quite read. Something about that stillness made Sarah's foot ease off the accelerator. She told herself that she was just slowing down to get a better look, that she was not actually going to stop. But her truck was already pulling over to the shoulder, her hand already reaching for the air brake before her conscious mind had fully decided what to do. The rain hammered against her windshield, the wipers working frantically to clear her view. She sat there for a long moment, the engine idling, debating whether to drive away. Through her passenger window, she could see the woman still standing in the same spot, about 30 feet behind her truck now. The woman had not moved, had not even turned to look at the truck that had stopped for her. Sarah felt a cold sensation spreading through her chest, but she could not quite identify it as fear, not yet. It was more like the feeling of having forgotten something important, something that her subconscious was trying desperately to remind her about. She opened her door and stepped down into the rain, immediately feeling the cold water soaking through her jacket. She called out to the woman, asking if she needed help, if she wanted a ride to the next town. The woman did not respond, did not even acknowledge that Sarah had spoken. Sarah walked closer, her boots splashing through puddles on the side of the road. As she approached, she began to notice details that made her steps slow, made that cold feeling in her chest grow stronger. The woman's dress was not just wet, it was dripping, as if she had been standing in the rain for hours, or as if she had just climbed out of deep water. Her hair hung in dark, wet ropes around her face, obscuring her features. Her feet were bare, pale and almost luminescent against the dark asphalt. Sarah called out again, louder this time, and finally the woman's head turned, moving with a slow, mechanical precision that reminded Sarah of an owl, rotating its head to focus on prey. The woman's face was beautiful in a way that made Sarah's breath catch, but it was also wrong somehow, too symmetrical, too perfect, like a mask or a painting rather than a real human face. The woman's eyes were the worst part. They were completely black, reflecting nothing, absorbing all light that fell into them. The woman smiled, and her teeth were too white, too many of them, filling her mouth in rows that seemed to go back farther than should have been possible. Sarah felt her legs locking up, every instinct screaming at her to run, but she found that she could not move. The woman spoke then, and her voice was like wind through empty rooms, like whispers echoing in abandoned buildings. She asked Sarah for a ride, asked if Sarah was going west, asked if there was room in the truck for one more. Sarah heard herself saying yes, heard herself offering directions to her truck, heard herself apologizing for the mess in the cab. It was as if someone else was controlling her voice, using her mouth to form words that she did not want to speak. She walked back to her truck with the woman following a few steps behind, and she could hear the wet slapping sound of bare feet on pavement. Sarah climbed back into her cab, and the woman climbed in after her, moving with an unnatural fluidity, as if her joints bent in directions that human joints should not bend. The woman settled into the passenger seat, and Sarah noticed that she was not dripping anymore, that her dress was now completely dry, that her hair had arranged itself into perfect waves that framed her face. The woman was not wearing a seatbelt, and when Sarah mentioned this, the woman simply smiled that too wide smile and said that she would be fine, that nothing could hurt her now. Sarah pulled back onto the highway, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. She tried to focus on the road, on the white lines that divided the lanes, on anything except the woman sitting beside her. But she could feel the woman's presence like a physical weight, could feel those black eyes watching her, studying her, evaluating her in ways that she could not begin to understand. The woman began to talk, asking Sarah questions about her life, her family, her fears. Sarah answered without meaning to, the words spilling out of her as if the woman was pulling them from her mind like threads from a tapestry. She told the woman things she had never told anyone, secrets and regrets and painful memories that she had tried for years to bury. The miles passed, and Sarah began to notice that the highway looked different. The landscape outside her windows had changed, though she could not remember passing through any transition. The fields and hills were gone, replaced by a flat emptiness that stretched in all directions, featureless and gray. There were no other vehicles on the road, no lights in the distance, nothing but her truck moving through this void. She looked at her GPS, but the screen showed only static. Her radio produced nothing but white noise on every channel. Her phone had no signal, the screen displaying a time that could not be correct. The woman beside her laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and told Sarah that they had left the regular roads behind, that they were traveling on paths that most people never see, roads that exist in the spaces between the world that humans know. Sarah wanted to stop the truck, wanted to demand that the woman get out, but she found that her foot would not move from the accelerator, that her hands would not turn the steering wheel. She was a prisoner in her own body, able to see and hear and feel, but unable to control her own actions. The woman told her not to worry, that the journey would not last much longer, that they were almost at the place where Sarah needed to be. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came from her throat. Tears ran down her face, and the woman reached out with one pale hand to wipe them away, her fingers ice cold against Sarah's skin. The woman told her that crying would not help, that what was happening had been decided long ago, on a night when Sarah had made a different choice, when she had driven past someone who needed help, when she had chosen her own safety over compassion for a stranger. Sarah remembered then with sudden and terrible clarity a night 5 years ago when she had seen someone standing on the side of a different road, in a different state, during a different storm. She had not stopped that night, had told herself that it was too dangerous, that she could not risk it. She had driven past, and in her rearview mirror, she had seen the figure standing in the rain, watching her taillights disappear into the distance. The woman beside her nodded as if reading Sarah's thoughts, and confirmed that yes, that had been her, standing in the rain, waiting for someone to stop, waiting for someone to show kindness. Sarah tried to apologize, tried to explain that she had been afraid, but the woman placed a finger against Sarah's lips, silencing her. The truck began to slow down, though Sarah's foot remained pressed on the accelerator. Ahead, she could see lights appearing in the void, a cluster of buildings that materialized out of nothing. The woman told her that they had arrived, that this was the place where Sarah would be staying from now on. Sarah could see other trucks parked outside the buildings, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all sitting silent and dark. The woman explained that all of these trucks belonged to drivers who had made the same choice Sarah had made, drivers who had passed by someone in need, drivers who had chosen themselves over others. Now they were all here, driving endless routes on roads that went nowhere, carrying cargo that did not exist, forever moving but never arriving. Sarah's truck rolled to a stop in front of one of the buildings, and the woman opened her door, preparing to leave. She turned back to Sarah and told her that someone would be along shortly to give her the details of her next route, that there was always another delivery to make in this place, that the roads here never ended, and the night never became day. The woman climbed down from the cab, and Sarah watched her walk toward the building, her white dress seeming to glow in the darkness. Other figures emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, all wearing white, all moving with that same unnatural fluidity. They surrounded Sarah's truck, and she could feel them watching her through the windows, could feel their cold presence pressing in from all sides. Sarah sits in her truck still, waiting for instructions that she knows will come, waiting to begin driving again on roads that lead nowhere. Sometimes she thinks she can hear other trucks starting their engines, other drivers beginning their own endless journeys. She wonders if they remember how they got here, if they remember the choices they made, the people they failed to help. She wonders if she will ever be forgiven, if there is any way back to the world she left behind. But deep down she knows the answer. This is her road now, this gray and endless void, and she will drive it forever alone with her regrets, carrying the weight of a single moment when she chose wrong, when she passed by someone who needed her, when she convinced herself that fear was more important than compassion. The engine starts again without her touching the key, and her hands move to grip the steering wheel, and her foot presses down on the accelerator, and she drives forward into the empty gray expanse, beginning another journey that will never end. Story 3. The truck stop that doesn't exist. Miguel had stopped at thousands of truck stops during his career, from the massive travel centers that lined the interstates to the small mom-and-pop operations that barely had room for half a dozen trucks. He prided himself on knowing the best stops on every major route, the ones with the cleanest showers, the best food, the friendliest staff. So when he saw the sign for a truck stop he had never heard of before, right in the middle of a stretch of I-40 in New Mexico that he had driven hundreds of times, his curiosity was immediately piqued. The sign was weathered and old-fashioned, made of wood rather than the illuminated plastic that most modern signs used. It advertised diesel, food, and lodging, and it promised that the stop was only 2 miles ahead. Miguel checked his fuel gauge and saw that he was running lower than he had thought. He decided to stop, both to refuel and to see what this place was all about. The exit ramp appeared right where the sign had promised, though Miguel could not remember ever noticing it before. He guided his truck down the ramp and onto a narrow 2-lane road that curved away from the highway, running between low hills covered in scrub brush. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and long shadows stretched across the landscape. Miguel felt a strange sense of anticipation building in his chest, though he could not have said why. It was just a truck stop after all, probably nothing special, certainly nothing worth getting excited about, but there was something about the way the road twisted through the hills, something about the quality of the light, that made him feel as if he was driving into a different time, a different world altogether. The truck stop appeared around the next bend, and Miguel immediately understood that this was not a modern establishment. The main building was constructed of wood and stone, with a wide front porch and windows that glowed with warm yellow light. There were a dozen or so trucks parked in the lot, all of them older models, the kind that Miguel had not seen on the roads in years. Some of them looked positively ancient, with rounded hoods and chrome details that belonged to trucks from the 1950s or 60s. Miguel parked his truck next to a beautiful old Kenworth, admiring its pristine condition as he climbed down from his cab. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, without the usual diesel fumes and highway exhaust that hung around most truck stops. Inside, the place was like stepping into the past. The floor was made of worn wooden planks that creaked under his boots. The walls were decorated with old photographs and vintage advertisements for motor oil and tire companies that Miguel vaguely remembered from his childhood. A long counter ran along one side of the room, behind which a woman in a waitress uniform from another era was pouring coffee for a customer. She looked up as Miguel entered, and her smile was warm and genuine. She told him to sit anywhere he liked, that she would be right with him. Miguel chose a booth near the window where he could keep an eye on his truck. The other customers in the diner were all men, all dressed in the kind of clothing that truckers had worn decades ago, jeans and flannel shirts and leather jackets. They glanced at Miguel when he sat down, but their looks were not unfriendly, just curious, as if they were trying to figure out where he had come from. The waitress brought him a menu, and Miguel was surprised to see that the prices were incredibly low, the kind of prices he remembered from his childhood in the 1980s. He ordered a burger and coffee, and the waitress wrote down his order on a paper pad, not on the tablets that most restaurants use nowadays. While he waited for his food, Miguel looked out the window at his truck and he noticed something odd. His truck looked out of place here, too modern, too sleek compared to the vintage vehicles that surrounded it. It was as if his truck had been transported here from the future, dropped into a scene from the past. The thought made him uncomfortable and he tried to shake it off, telling himself that he was just tired, that his imagination was running away with him. His food arrived and it was delicious, the kind of home-cooked meal that he rarely found at modern truck stops. The burger was thick and juicy, the fries were crispy and perfectly salted, and the coffee was strong and hot. Miguel ate slowly, savoring every bite, and as he ate, he listened to the conversations happening around him. The other truckers were talking about routes and loads, about weather and road conditions, but there was something strange about their conversations. They mentioned cities and highways that Miguel knew, but they talked about them as if things were different, as if the roads had not yet been expanded, as if certain truck stops and rest areas had not yet been built. One man complained about the new interstate system that was being constructed, about how it was going to put all the old highways out of business. Another man mentioned that he was planning to buy one of those new trucks with air conditioning, something that would make the summer runs a lot more comfortable. Miguel realized with a growing sense of unease that these men were talking as if it was still the 1960s or 70s, as if the modern world he knew had not yet come into existence. He told himself that this must be some kind of theme restaurant, a place that went to great lengths to create an authentic vintage atmosphere. But the explanation felt hollow. Everything here was too perfect, too real. The waitress's smile was not the practiced smile of someone playing a role. The ware on the wooden floor was not artfully distressed to look old. The photographs on the walls were not reproductions. Everything here was genuine, and that should not have been possible. He finished his meal and walked up to the counter to pay. The waitress told him the total, an amount so low that Miguel thought she must have made a mistake. He pulled out his wallet and realized that the bills inside looked wrong, too colorful, too modern compared to the faded currency that he saw in the cash register. The waitress looked at his money with confusion, examining the bills as if she had never seen anything like them before. She called over to another employee, an older man who might have been the manager, and showed him Miguel's money. The man studied the bills carefully, his brow furrowed, then looked up at Miguel with an expression that was part confusion and part something else, something that might have been fear. The man asked Miguel where he had gotten this money, what year it was from. Miguel told him that it was regular money, current United States currency, and that the year was 2024. The man's face went pale and he took a step backward. The other customers in the diner had gone quiet, all of them now staring at Miguel. The waitress put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. The manager told Miguel that this was not possible, that the year was 1973, that Miguel's money did not exist yet, that Miguel himself should not be here. Miguel laughed nervously, thinking this was all part of the theme, some elaborate joke they played on customers. But nobody else was laughing. The expressions on their faces were deadly serious. Miguel backed toward the door, suddenly desperate to leave, to get back in his truck and return to the highway. He pushed through the door and out onto the porch, and the world seemed to tilt around him. The sky was darker than it had been, the stars brighter, arranged in patterns that looked almost but not quite familiar. He ran to his truck and climbed inside, his hands shaking as he started the engine. The other truckers had emerged from the diner and were standing on the porch watching him, their faces unreadable in the dim light. Miguel put his truck in gear and drove toward the exit, toward the road that would take him back to the highway. But the road looked different now. It stretched out before him, narrow and dark, winding through hills that seemed higher and more ominous than they had been before. He drove for what felt like hours, searching for the highway, searching for any sign that would tell him where he was. But the road just went on and on, never reaching the interstate, never intersecting with any other road. His fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should have been, and his GPS showed nothing but error messages. His phone had no signal and his radio picked up only static. Panic began to set in, cold and tight in his chest. He thought about turning around, going back to the truck stop. But when he looked in his rearview mirror, he could not see it anymore. There was only darkness behind him, deep and absolute. Finally, after what might have been hours or might have been days, Miguel saw lights ahead. His heart leapt with hope, thinking he had finally found his way back to the interstate. But as he drew closer, he realized with a sinking feeling that the lights belonged to the truck stop. The same truck stop he had left behind. He was back where he had started, as if the road had formed a loop, as if there was no way out. The old trucks were still parked in the lot, and the diner was still glowing with warm light. Miguel considered driving past, continuing on the road to see if it might lead somewhere else this time. But his fuel gauge was now dangerously low, the needle hovering just above empty. He pulled into the parking lot and turned off his engine, sitting in his cab and trying to think. The door to the diner opened and the manager stepped out onto the porch. He walked slowly toward Miguel's truck, his movements careful and deliberate. Miguel rolled down his window and the manager stopped a few feet away. He told Miguel that he was sorry, that sometimes people from other times wandered onto this road, that they usually found their way back eventually, but that it could take a while. He explained that this place existed in a pocket, a bubble of time that had somehow separated from the normal flow of years, that the people here were trapped in 1973 and could not leave. But people from other times sometimes stumbled into this pocket, and when they did, leaving could be difficult. The manager told Miguel that he should come inside, have some more coffee, wait until morning. Sometimes, he said, the road looked different in daylight and sometimes people could find their way out. Miguel asked what would happen if he could not find his way out. What would happen if he was stuck here forever? The manager did not answer directly, but his silence spoke volumes. Miguel looked at the other trucks in the parking lot, at those beautiful old vehicles that should have been in museums or private collections, and he wondered how long they had been here, how long their drivers had been trapped in this bubble of time. He wondered if he would become like them, if his modern truck would slowly blend into this anachronistic scene, if he would forget about the world he had come from, if he would spend the rest of his existence having the same conversations, driving the same loop of road, waiting for a morning that might never truly come. He sits in his truck still, as the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, as the lights in the diner glow steadily through the darkness, as the other drivers sleep in their cabs or sit on the porch trading stories that never change. He has tried the road a dozen times, 100 times, always ending up back at the truck stop. His fuel tank never quite empties. His food supplies never quite run out. His body never quite grows older. Time here is stuck, frozen, and he is stuck with it. Sometimes new trucks arrive. Modern vehicles driven by confused drivers who wandered onto the wrong exit ramp. Miguel tries to warn them, tries to tell them to conserve their fuel, to accept that they might be here for a very long time. Some of them listen, some of them panic and drive off into the darkness, and some of them never come back. And Miguel wonders if they found their way out or if they are simply driving that loop of road forever, searching for an exit that does not exist. He knows he should go inside, should have that coffee the manager offered, should try to make friends with the other drivers, should accept his fate, but he cannot quite bring himself to do it, cannot quite accept that this is his life now. So he sits in his truck staring at the road, hoping that this one time when he starts his engine and drives toward that curve in the road, he will find himself back on I-40, back in his own time, back in the world where he belongs. Story 4. The Delivery to Nowhere. Frank had been given strange delivery addresses before, but nothing quite like this one. The GPS coordinates led to a spot in the Nevada desert, miles from any town or highway, in a region that maps simply labeled as government land. The cargo manifest was vague, listing only scientific equipment as the contents of his trailer, and the payment was substantial enough that Frank knew better than to ask questions. He had made deliveries to remote locations before, to mining operations and research stations and off-grid communities, so he told himself this was no different. But as he turned off the paved highway onto a dirt road that was barely more than 2 tracks through the sand, he felt a familiar unease settling into his bones. The road stretched ahead of him, perfectly straight, running toward a horizon that seemed impossibly distant. There were no landmarks, no variation in the landscape, just endless flat desert covered in scrub brush and rocks. Frank checked his odometer, noting the distance, telling himself that he would turn around if he did not find the delivery location within a reasonable distance. But reasonable was a relative term out here, where the land seemed to swallow distance, where what looked like a mile away might actually be 5 or 10. The sun was high overhead, beating down mercilessly, and even with his air conditioning running full blast, Frank could feel the heat seeping into his cab. He drank water from the bottle in his cup holder and wiped sweat from his forehead, wondering not for the first time what he had gotten himself into. After about an hour of driving, he saw something in the distance, a structure of some kind rising from the flat desert floor. As he drew closer, he could see that it was a building, or rather a series of buildings, all constructed of metal that gleamed in the harsh sunlight. There were no signs, no fences, no indication of what this place might be. Just buildings and a few vehicles parked nearby, trucks and jeeps that were covered in dust. Frank pulled up to what appeared to be a loading area and parked his truck, setting the air brake and climbing down into the furnace heat of the afternoon. The temperature hit him like a physical force, and he immediately began to sweat, feeling the moisture evaporating almost as soon as it appeared on his skin. A man emerged from one of the buildings dressed in khaki pants and a white shirt, looking remarkably cool and comfortable despite the heat. He approached Frank with a clipboard in hand and introduced himself as Dr. Carson, the facility manager. Frank asked what kind of facility this was, what they did out here in the middle of nowhere. Dr. Carson smiled but did not answer the question directly. He simply said that they were conducting research, that it was important work, that Frank's delivery was exactly what they had been waiting for. He handed Frank the clipboard and indicated where he should sign. Frank noticed that the paperwork was more extensive than usual, with multiple forms and waivers, including a non-disclosure agreement that stated Frank could never discuss this location or what he had seen here with anyone. Frank signed the forms, figuring that the money he was being paid bought their right to secrecy as well as his services. Dr. Carson called over several other people, all dressed in similar khaki and white outfits, and they began the process of unloading Frank's trailer. They worked efficiently, using a forklift to remove large crates, handling them with a care that suggested the contents were either very valuable or very fragile. Frank asked if he could use their facilities, if they had a bathroom and maybe some cold water. Dr. Carson nodded and gestured toward one of the buildings, telling Frank to follow him. Inside the building was blessedly cool. The air conditioning turned so low that Frank felt goosebumps rising on his sweat-dampened skin. The interior was sterile and modern, all white walls and tile floors, with fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead. Dr. Carson showed Frank to a bathroom and told him there was a break room down the hall where he could find water and coffee. Frank used the facilities and then wandered toward the break room, his boots squeaking on the polished floor. The hallway was lined with doors, all of them closed, all of them labeled with numbers rather than names. Through some of the doors, Frank could hear sounds, low humming noises, and occasional beeps that suggested machinery of some kind. He found the break room and poured himself a cup of water from a cooler, drinking it down quickly and then pouring another. The room had a large window that looked out onto the desert, and Frank stood there for a moment, staring out at the endless expanse of sand and rock, wondering what could possibly be important enough to justify building a facility all the way out here. That was when he saw them. At first he thought they were people, figures walking across the desert about 100 yards from the building. But there was something wrong about the way they moved. Something too smooth, too synchronized. Frank pressed closer to the window, squinting against the glare of the sun on sand, trying to get a better look. The figures were tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 or 9 feet high. Their proportions were wrong, their limbs too long, their bodies too thin. They moved in a group, 7 or 8 of them, walking in perfect formation toward the facility. Frank felt his mouth go dry, felt his heart begin to pound in his chest. He told himself he was seeing things, that the heat and the strange environment were playing tricks on his eyes. But the figures were still there, still walking, growing closer with each passing second. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Dr. Carson entering the break room. The doctor's expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes, a wariness or perhaps a warning. Frank asked what those things were out there, what he was looking at. Dr. Carson walked to the window and looked out, his face showing no surprise, no concern. He told Frank that what he was seeing was classified, that the non-disclosure agreement Frank had signed covered this as well. Frank insisted on knowing, saying that he had a right to understand what was happening at a place he had just delivered cargo to. Dr. Carson sighed and sat down at one of the break room tables, gesturing for Frank to join him. The doctor explained that the facility was a research station, that they studied certain phenomena that occurred in this region of the desert. He did not use the word alien, but the implication was clear. The figures Frank had seen were visitors, entities that appeared in this area with some regularity, that the facility had been built to observe them, to attempt communication, to try to understand their purpose. Frank asked if they were dangerous, if he was in danger. Dr. Carson said that the entities had never shown hostility, that they seemed to be conducting their own research, studying the earth and its inhabitants with the same curiosity that humans studied them. But he added that no one really knew what the entities were capable of, what they might do if provoked or threatened. Frank felt a cold fear spreading through his body, despite the comfortable temperature in the room. He said that he wanted to leave, that he wanted to get in his truck and drive away as quickly as possible. Dr. Carson nodded understandingly, but told Frank that might not be wise at the moment. The entities were moving toward the facility, and they did not react well to vehicles trying to leave while they were nearby. It was better to wait inside to let them complete whatever business they had here, and then Frank could leave safely. Frank asked how long that might take. Dr. Carson did not have an answer. Sometimes the entities stayed for minutes, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. There was no way to predict their behavior. Frank walked back to the window, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The figures were much closer now, close enough that he could see details that made his skin crawl. Their skin, if it could be called skin, seemed to shimmer and shift as if they were not entirely solid, as if they existed only partially in this reality. They had heads but no faces that Frank could discern, just smooth surfaces that occasionally rippled like water disturbed by wind. Their long limbs ended in appendages that were neither hands nor claws but something in between. They moved without making any sound, gliding across the desert sand as if gravity affected them differently. Frank watched as they approached the building, watched as they moved to surround it, positioning themselves at intervals around the perimeter. Dr. Carson explained that this was their typical behavior, that they would remain in these positions for a period of time, and then they would leave as suddenly as they had arrived. He said that researchers believed the entities were scanning the facility, gathering information, perhaps even communicating with each other through means that humans could not detect. Frank asked what the entities wanted, what they were looking for. Dr. Carson admitted that after years of observation they still did not know. The entities did not attempt to enter the buildings, did not respond to attempts at communication, did not react to the presence of humans except to avoid direct contact. They simply appeared, observed, and then vanished, leaving no trace of their presence except for the memories of those who had seen them. Hours passed, and the entities remained in their positions around the facility. Frank tried to sleep in the break room, tried to distract himself by reading magazines that were scattered around the room, tried anything to avoid thinking about the impossible creatures standing just outside, but his mind kept returning to them, kept imagining what might happen if they decided to enter the building, what they might do to the people inside. Dr. Carson and the other researchers seemed unconcerned, going about their business as if having alien entities surrounding the facility was completely normal. Frank supposed that for them it was. Night fell, and through the window Frank could see the entities illuminated by the facility's exterior lights. They had not moved, had not changed position, had remained as still as statues for hours. Frank thought they looked even more unsettling in the darkness, their shimmering forms casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their bodies. He asked Dr. Carson if he could sleep in the break room, if there was a couch or cot somewhere. The doctor showed him to a small room with a bed, explaining that they kept several rooms ready for visiting personnel. Frank thanked him and lay down, though he doubted he would be able to sleep. The room was windowless and silent, but Frank could still feel the presence of the entities outside, could still picture them standing in their perfect circle around the building. He must have dozed off eventually, because he woke to Dr. Carson shaking his shoulder gently, telling him that it was morning, that the entities had left during the night, that Frank was free to go. Frank sat up, disoriented, his mouth dry and his head aching. He followed Dr. Carson back to the loading area, where his truck sat waiting, his trailer now empty. Dr. Carson handed Frank an envelope, telling him that inside was his payment, plus a substantial bonus for his discretion and his patience. He reminded Frank of the non-disclosure agreement, told him that it was important he never speak of what he had seen here, that there were serious consequences for violating such agreements. Frank nodded, took the envelope, and climbed into his truck. He drove away from that place as fast as the dirt road would allow, his truck bouncing and swaying over the rough surface. He did not look back, did not want to see the facility shrinking in his rearview mirror. He drove until he reached the paved highway, and then he kept driving, putting as many miles as possible between himself and that place. But even now, weeks later, he cannot stop thinking about what he saw. He has nightmares about those tall, shimmering figures, about their faceless heads and their too long limbs. He wonders what they were, where they came from, what they wanted. He wonders if they are still there, still surrounding that facility, still observing and scanning and gathering their incomprehensible data. And sometimes, late at night, when he is driving alone on dark highways, he thinks he sees them in the distance, standing at the side of the road watching him pass, and he wonders if they know who he is, if they remember him, if they are waiting for him to return. He has thrown away the business card Dr. Carson gave him, has deleted the GPS coordinates from his navigation system, has done everything he can to forget about that place and that delivery. But he knows he will never truly forget, knows that the memory of those entities will stay with him forever, a reminder that the world is stranger and more frightening than he ever imagined. Story 5. The Mirror Truck. Jen had been driving through Utah when she first noticed the truck. It appeared in her rearview mirror around dusk, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains to the west. At first, there was nothing particularly unusual about it, just another 18-wheeler on the same highway, maintaining a reasonable distance behind her. But as the minutes passed and the sky darkened, Jen began to notice something strange. The truck behind her was identical to her own. Same make, same model, same color scheme, right down to the company logo on the side. She worked for a major freight company, so seeing another truck from the same fleet was not particularly unusual. But something about this truck felt wrong in a way she could not quite articulate. She tried to get a better look at it through her mirrors, but the growing darkness made it difficult to see details. The truck maintained its position behind her, never getting closer, never falling back, just staying there at the same constant distance. Jen reached for her CB radio and switched to the company channel, calling out to the other driver. There was no response, just static. She tried again, identifying herself by her handle and her truck number, asking if anyone could hear her. Still nothing but static. She switched through several channels, trying to reach any other driver who might be in the area. But all she got was that same empty static, as if every frequency had been abandoned. The highway stretched ahead of her, mostly empty of traffic, winding through rocky terrain dotted with sagebrush. There were no towns nearby, no truck stops, no places to pull over except for the occasional rest area. Jen decided to take the next exit she came to, thinking that if the other truck followed her, at least she would know for certain that something was wrong. If it did not follow, she could chalk up her unease to road fatigue and too many hours behind the wheel. She saw a sign indicating a rest area 5 miles ahead, and she moved into the right lane, slowing down slightly. In her mirror, she saw the other truck change lanes as well, matching her movements exactly. At the rest area, Jen pulled into a parking spot and set her air brake, her heart pounding harder than the situation seemed to warrant. The other truck pulled in behind her, parking in the spot directly behind hers, its headlights illuminating her cab. Jen climbed down from her truck, her hand instinctively reaching for the tire iron she kept clipped to the inside of her door, a tool that could also serve as a weapon if necessary. She walked back toward the other truck, squinting against its headlights trying to see who was in the cab. The light suddenly shut off, and in the dim illumination of the rest area's sodium lamps, Jen could see the figure sitting in the driver's seat. It was her. The driver in the other truck looked exactly like Jen. Same face, same hair, same posture. Jen felt her breath catch in her throat, felt reality seem to twist around her. She took a step backward, her hand tightening on the tire iron. The other Jen climbed down from the truck, moving slowly, deliberately, her expression blank and unreadable. She walked toward Jen, and Jen noticed that the other woman's movements were perfect mirrors of her own, as if she was looking at her reflection in glass, except that this reflection was walking toward her instead of mimicking her actions. Jen called out, demanding to know who this person was, what kind of trick this was. The other Jen did not respond, just kept walking, kept approaching with that same blank expression. Jen turned and ran back to her truck, throwing the tire iron inside and climbing up into the cab, slamming and locking the door. She started the engine and threw the truck into gear, not even bothering to check her mirrors as she pulled out of the parking spot. In her rearview mirror, she could see the other Jen standing where she had left her, just standing there motionless, watching Jen drive away. Jen accelerated back onto the highway, her truck roaring as she pushed it faster than she normally would have, desperate to put distance between herself and that impossible figure. She drove for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, constantly checking her mirrors, making sure nothing was following her. The highway was empty behind her, just darkness and the occasional reflective marker glinting in her taillights. She began to relax slightly, telling herself that she had imagined it, that the figure could not possibly have been her, that it had just been someone who resembled her, a coincidence made more sinister by exhaustion and darkness. But then the lights appeared in her mirror again, twin points of illumination, a truck catching up to her from behind. Jen watched in growing horror as the truck drew closer, close enough that she could see it was the same truck, her mirror truck, her impossible double. She pressed down harder on the accelerator, pushing her truck to speeds that made the steering wheel shake in her hands, made the engine groan with effort. The other truck matched her speed exactly, maintaining that same constant distance behind her. Jen's mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, trying to find some rational explanation. She thought about hallucinations, about carbon monoxide poisoning, about some kind of elaborate prank. But none of these explanations felt right. The truck behind her was too real, too solid, too persistent. She grabbed her phone from the dashboard mount, thinking she would call the police, call her dispatcher, call anyone who might be able to help. But her phone showed no signal, the screen displaying only a message saying searching for service. She was in the middle of Utah, on a major interstate highway, and her phone claimed it could find no signal at all. That should not have been possible. Ahead, she saw lights indicating a town, a real town with buildings and street lamps and signs of civilization. Relief flooded through her. She would drive into this town, would stop at a police station or a well-lit gas station, would find people who could help her, who could witness what was happening. The highway curved, taking her off the interstate and onto the main street of the town. But as she drove deeper into the town, her relief turned to confusion and then to a new kind of fear. The street was empty. The buildings were dark. There were no cars parked along the road, no lights in any windows, no signs of life anywhere. The town looked abandoned, as if everyone had simply walked away and left everything behind. Jen drove slowly down the main street, her eyes scanning the buildings, looking for any indication of people, any sign that this town was inhabited. Behind her, the mirror truck followed at its constant distance, its presence now feeling less like a threat and more like the only other real thing in this empty place. Jen came to the end of the main street and found that the road simply stopped, ending at a brick wall that should not have been there. a wall that blocked any further progress. She slammed on her brakes, her truck stopping just feet from the wall. The mirror truck stopped behind her, and Jen watched in her mirror as the other Jen climbed down from the cab. This time, Jen did not run. Something had changed. Some understanding had crystallized in her mind, though she could not have put it into words. She climbed down from her own truck and walked back to meet her double. The two women stood facing each other, identical in every way, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then the other Jen smiled, and it was a sad smile, a smile full of regret and resignation. She told Jen that she was sorry, that she had not wanted this, that she had tried to warn her but had not known how. She explained that this place, this empty town, this impossible situation, was a kind of trap, a place that existed between reality and something else, a place where people who made certain choices ended up. Jen asked what choice she had made, what had brought her to this place. The other Jen told her that it had happened 3 years ago at a truck stop in Nevada. Jen had been offered a job transporting cargo that she knew was probably illegal. She had taken the job because the money was good, because she had told herself that what people did with the cargo after she delivered it was not her responsibility. That choice had marked her, had created a kind of debt, and this place was where that debt came due. The other Jen was what she would become, what she was becoming. A reflection that would eventually replace her completely, that would take over her life while the real Jen remained trapped here in this empty space. Jen protested that this was not fair, that one bad choice should not condemn her to this fate. The other Jen agreed that it was not fair, but said that fairness had nothing to do with it. This was simply how things worked, a consequence that followed certain actions as inevitably as gravity pulled objects to the ground. But there was a way out, the other Jen said. There was always a way out, though it required a sacrifice. Jen could return to her real life, could escape this place, but only if she was willing to give up driving, to give up the career she had built, to never climb into a truck cab again. If she made that promise and kept it, the debt would be paid, and she would be free. Jen thought about her life as a driver, about the freedom of the open road, about the satisfaction of long-distance travel and successful deliveries. She thought about giving it all up, about finding a new career, about starting over. It would be hard, maybe impossible. Driving was all she knew, all she had done since she was old enough to get a commercial license. But as she looked at her double, at this hollow version of herself with empty eyes and a sad smile, she knew she had no real choice. She told the other Jen that she agreed, that she would give up driving, that she would never sit behind the wheel of a truck again. The other Jen nodded, and as she did, she began to fade, becoming transparent, becoming less solid, until finally she was gone completely, leaving Jen standing alone in the middle of that empty street. The mirror truck was gone too, vanished as if it had never existed. Jen turned and walked back to her own truck, climbed into the cab one last time. The engine started normally, and when she put the truck in reverse, the brick wall was no longer behind her. The street now opened up, leading her back toward the highway. She drove through the empty town, and as she did, lights began to come on in the buildings, cars appeared on the streets, people materialized on the sidewalks. The town was coming to life around her, returning to normal reality. By the time she reached the highway, everything looked perfectly ordinary, as if the empty town had never existed. Jen drove to the nearest city and parked her truck at a terminal. She walked into the office and told her dispatcher that she was quitting, effective immediately. He protested, reminded her of her contract, told her she was one of their best drivers. But Jen was firm. She told him she was done, that she would never drive again. She signed the necessary paperwork, handed over her keys, and walked out of that office into a new life. She kept her promise. She found work in an office, learned new skills, built a new career. She never climbed into a truck cab again, never even felt tempted to, because sometimes late at night when she is driving her personal car on empty highways, she thinks she sees a truck in her rearview mirror, A truck that looks like her old truck, driven by a figure that looks like her, and she knows that the other Jen is still out there somewhere. Driving those empty roads between reality and nightmare, carrying out the sentence that Jen escaped, serving the time that should have been hers. She made a promise and she will never break it, because she knows that if she does, the mirror truck will return, and next time there will be no escape, no bargain, no second chance. Story 6. The Singing Highway. Tom had heard about the Singing Highway from other truckers, though he had always assumed it was just another urban legend, the kind of story that drivers told each other to pass the time on long hauls. According to the legend, there was a stretch of highway somewhere in the Midwest where the road itself sang, where the sound of tires on pavement created musical tones that formed melodies, songs that no one had written, songs that seemed to come from the road itself. Different drivers reported hearing different songs, and all of them said the experience was unsettling, though none could quite explain why. Tom had laughed when he first heard the story, chalking it up to pattern recognition and tired minds finding meaning in random noise. But then he found himself on that stretch of highway, somewhere in southern Illinois, and he discovered that the legend was absolutely true. It started subtly, just a change in the sound his tires made on the pavement. Instead of the usual rhythmic hum, he began to hear distinct musical notes rising and falling in pitch as he drove. At first he thought something was wrong with his tires, that they had developed an uneven wear pattern that was creating these sounds. But as he continued driving, the notes organized themselves into a melody, a slow and mournful tune that sounded like something from a lullaby or a funeral dirge. Tom found himself humming along, the melody so catchy and persistent that it was impossible not to internalize it. He tried turning on his radio to drown it out, but no matter how loud he turned up the music, he could still hear the singing highway beneath it, its voice somehow cutting through every other sound. The melody was beautiful in a way that made Tom's chest feel tight, made his eyes water with tears he could not explain. It reminded him of things he had lost, people he had loved who were gone, opportunities he had missed, mistakes he could never undo. He found his mind wandering as he drove, slipping into memories both happy and sad, reliving moments from his past with a clarity that should not have been possible. He remembered his father teaching him to drive, remembered the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder, the pride in his voice when Tom successfully parallel parked for the first time. He remembered his wedding day, the way his wife had looked in her white dress, the promises they had made to each other. He remembered the day she left, the sound of the door closing, the empty spaces in the closet where her clothes had hung. The highway sang all of this to him, pulling these memories from some deep place in his mind, forcing him to confront them, forcing him to feel emotions he had spent years trying to bury. Tom realized that he was crying, tears running down his face, his vision blurring. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to clear them, trying to focus on the road ahead. But the melody continued, relentless and beautiful and terrible, and the memories kept coming. He remembered his son, remembered holding him as a baby, remembered teaching him to throw a baseball, remembered the argument that had driven them apart, the words that could never be taken back, the years of silence that had followed. Tom looked at the road ahead and saw something impossible. The highway was no longer straight. It had become a ribbon, twisting and turning in impossible ways, looping back on itself, forming shapes that hurt to look at, geometries that should not have existed in three-dimensional space. The white lines on the road glowed with their own internal light, pulsing in time with the melody. The fields on either side of the highway had become dark and featureless, just empty voids that seemed to stretch into infinity. Tom realized with a sudden jolt of fear that he had left normal reality behind, that the highway had carried him into some other place, some dimension where the rules of physics and geometry no longer applied. He tried to slow down, but his foot on the brake pedal had no effect. The truck continued at the same steady speed, carrying him forward along this impossible road. He tried to steer, but the steering wheel was locked in place, or rather it moved freely, but had no effect on the truck's direction. He was not driving anymore. He was just a passenger in his own vehicle, being carried along by forces he did not understand and could not control. The melody grew louder, and now he could hear words mixed in with the music, though he could not quite make them out. They seemed to be in a language he should have known but did not, or perhaps in multiple languages all at once, overlapping and harmonizing. The highway began to slope upward, climbing into the darkness above. Tom felt his stomach drop as the truck tilted back, its nose pointing toward the sky or toward whatever existed above this place. He gripped the steering wheel uselessly, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short gasps. The truck continued to climb, and Tom found himself looking out his windshield at a vast expanse of stars. Stars that were too bright and too close. Stars that moved and swirled in patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, consciousness. He understood then that the highway was not taking him to a destination. It was transforming him, breaking him down, dissolving the barriers between his mind and something much larger, much older, something that had existed long before humans had built roads and driven trucks. The melody reached a crescendo, all of his memories flooding back at once, not just the important ones, but every moment. Every second of his life replayed simultaneously. He felt himself expanding, his consciousness growing beyond the confines of his body, beyond the cab of his truck, beyond the highway itself. He could see everything, could feel everything. All the lives that had driven this road before him, all the memories the highway had collected, all the songs it had sung. He understood that the highway was alive in its own way, that it fed on the emotions of travelers, that it created its music from the joy and sorrow it absorbed, and he understood that he was becoming part of it, that his own memories and emotions were being woven into the highway's endless song, that he would sing here forever, adding his voice to the chorus of all those who had come before. But then suddenly it stopped. The melody cut off mid-note, and Tom found himself back on a normal highway, straight and flat, with normal fields on either side, with normal stars overhead. His truck was moving at a normal speed, responding normally to his inputs. His radio was playing a country song, and his GPS showed that he was exactly where he should have been, having lost no time at all. Tom pulled over to the shoulder and sat there, shaking, trying to convince himself that it had all been a hallucination, that he had fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. But he could still hear the echo of that melody in his mind, could still feel the weight of all those memories, all those emotions. He never drove that stretch of highway again, always taking alternate routes even when they added hours to his journey. But the melody stays with him. He hears it sometimes in the quiet moments, when he is alone with his thoughts, when he is trying to sleep. It calls to him, invites him to return, to finish what was started, to let go of his body and his individuality and become part of something larger. Most days he can resist it, can push it to the back of his mind, can focus on his job and his life. But some days, when he is particularly tired or particularly lonely, he finds himself thinking about that highway, about that beautiful, terrible song, about the peace that might come from surrendering to it. He knows that someday he might not be able to resist anymore, that someday he might find himself on that stretch of road again, and when that happens, he might not make it back to normal reality. The highway will claim him, will add his voice to its eternal chorus, and he will sing forever, warning and welcoming the travelers who come after him, calling them to experience the same beautiful, terrible transformation that almost consumed him. Story 7. The Cargo That Grew. Rita picked up the containers at a port in Houston, bound for a research facility in Montana. The manifest listed the contents as biological specimens, which usually meant preserved samples or laboratory animals. The containers were temperature-controlled units refrigerated to maintain a constant 4 degrees Celsius. Rita had transported similar cargo before, medical supplies and research materials, and she knew the protocols. Keep the refrigeration units running at all times, Maintain steady speed to minimize vibration. Do not open the containers under any circumstances. Standard procedure for valuable and sensitive cargo. The payment was excellent, and the pickup and delivery went smoothly. She loaded the 3 containers into her trailer, secured them properly, and hit the road, planning to reach Montana in 3 days with stops only for fuel and legally required rest periods. The first day passed without incident, hundreds of miles of Texas highway scrolling past her windows. Rita stopped at a truck stop outside Amarillo for the night, parking her rig in a well-lit spot near the main building. She did her usual walk-around inspection, checking the trailer connections, ensuring the refrigeration units were running properly. Everything looked fine. The units hummed steadily, their digital displays showing that the temperature inside remained constant. Rita went inside the truck stop for dinner and a shower, then returned to her cab to sleep. She had just settled into her bunk when she heard a sound from the trailer, a kind of scratching or scraping like something moving inside. She told herself it was just the refrigeration units, just the normal sounds that refrigerated trailers made. But the sound continued, rhythmic and persistent, and it sounded less like machinery and more like something alive. Rita climbed out of her bunk and went outside to investigate, bringing her flashlight. The trailer looked normal from the outside, the refrigeration unit still humming, the temperature displays still showing 4 degrees Celsius. But the sounds were definitely coming from inside the trailer, louder now, more aggressive. It sounded like something was trying to get out, scratching at the interior walls of the containers. Rita felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Biological specimens were supposed to be either preserved or contained in secure enclosures. They were not supposed to be moving around, not supposed to be scratching at anything. She checked the seals on the trailer doors, confirming they were intact. Whatever was inside was still contained, still secure. She told herself that she was imagining things, that the sounds had some innocent explanation. She went back to her cab, but she did not sleep well that night, jolting awake several times, thinking she heard those scratching sounds over the rumble of the refrigeration units. The next morning, Rita continued her journey, heading north through Colorado. The sounds from the trailer persisted throughout the day, growing louder and more frequent. Now it sounded like there were multiple things inside the containers, all of them moving, all of them scratching and scraping. Rita tried calling the research facility, wanting to report the situation, wanting to ask if this was normal. But the number they had given her went straight to voicemail, and her messages went unanswered. She tried the shipping company, but they told her that everything was fine, that the cargo was behaving as expected, that she should just continue her delivery as planned. Their reassurances did not make her feel better. In fact, they made her more nervous. They sounded like they were expecting this, like the scratching sounds were part of the plan. By that afternoon, Rita noticed that the temperature displays on the refrigeration units were changing. The units were still running, still humming with steady power, but the internal temperature was rising. It had climbed from 4 degrees Celsius to 10 degrees, then to 15, then to 20. Rita stopped at a rest area and went to investigate, checking the units thoroughly. They appeared to be functioning normally, coolant flowing, compressors running, but the temperature inside the trailer continued to climb. It was as if something inside the containers was generating heat, overwhelming the refrigeration system's ability to cool. And as the temperature rose, the sounds from inside grew more aggressive, more frantic. Rita knew she should refuse to continue, should call the police or abandon the load. But she thought about the money, thought about the contract she had signed, thought about the potential legal consequences of failing to complete the delivery. She convinced herself that everything would be fine, that she would just drive a little faster, get to Montana ahead of schedule, deliver the cargo, and be done with it. She pulled back onto the highway and increased her speed, pushing her truck harder than she normally would. But the temperature in the trailer continued to rise, reaching 30 degrees, then 40, then 50. At 50 degrees Celsius, the scratching sound stopped. replaced by a different sound, a wet sliding sound that Rita found even more disturbing. She was somewhere in Wyoming when she saw the first crack in one of the containers. She had pulled over to check on the cargo again, had opened her trailer doors, and there it was, a jagged split in the side of the middle container, with some kind of thick, yellowish liquid seeping out. The liquid smelled horrible, like rot and chemicals mixed together, and it was warm, almost hot to the touch. Rita backed away from the container, her hand over her mouth and nose, fighting the urge to vomit. She pulled out her phone to call for help, to call anyone, but before she could dial, she heard a louder cracking sound. The container split open, the sides bulging outward, and something emerged from inside. Rita's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. It looked organic, alive, but it was not any creature she could identify. It was roughly spherical, about the size of a beach ball, covered in a translucent membrane that revealed pulsing organs or structures inside. It had no eyes, no mouth, no limbs that she could see, just that membrane and the things moving inside it. But it was definitely alive, definitely aware, because it moved with purpose, rolling out of the broken container and onto the floor of her trailer. And then another one emerged, and another, 6 or 7 of them, all rolling and pulsing and moving with that same disturbing purposefulness. Rita ran back to her cab and locked the doors, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the ignition. She started the engine and drove, leaving the trailer doors hanging open, the things inside exposed to the air. She drove as fast as she dared, watching her mirrors, terrified that the things would somehow get into her cab. But they did not follow. They rolled out of the trailer and dropped onto the highway, and in her mirrors, Rita could see them bouncing and rolling away into the darkness, dispersing into the Wyoming landscape. She drove until she found a town, pulled into a police station parking lot, and stumbled inside to report what had happened. The police were skeptical at first, but they followed her back to where she had left her trailer. The containers were indeed broken open. The yellowish liquid pooled on the trailer floor. But the creatures were gone, scattered into the landscape. The police called in state authorities, who called in federal authorities, who called in people in hazmat suits who would not tell Rita who they worked for. They questioned her for hours, asking about what she had seen, where the creatures had gone, how long it had taken for the containers to break open. They told her the cargo should never have been transported via commercial truck, that there had been a mistake, that she should forget everything she had seen and never speak of it to anyone. They paid her well for her silence, a sum large enough that she could take several months off from driving, but Rita knows that she will never really forget what she saw. She has nightmares about those things, those pulsing spheres rolling across the landscape. She wonders what they are doing out there. Whether they are growing, whether they are multiplying, whether they pose some threat that the authorities are keeping secret. She has tried to research what she saw, but she finds no information, no similar reports, nothing to explain what those things were or where they came from. Sometimes she drives past the stretch of highway where she released them, and she looks out at the empty landscape, and she wonders if they are still out there, if they are watching her. If they remember that she carried them, that she brought them to this place. She tells herself that they were probably contained by the authorities, that they were probably destroyed or captured, but she does not really believe it. She believes those things are still out there somewhere, growing and changing and becoming something that the world is not ready for. Story 8. The Rest Stop Paradox. Eddie had stopped at the rest area dozens of times over his 10-year career. It was a convenient spot right off Interstate 70 in Kansas, about halfway through his usual route. The rest area was typical for the region, a small building with restrooms and vending machines, a few picnic tables under a shelter, a parking lot with spaces for both cars and trucks. Eddie knew this place well, could probably navigate it blindfolded. So when he pulled in late one Thursday night, exhausted after 14 hours of driving, he expected everything to be exactly as it always was. And it was at first. He parked his truck, used the facilities, bought a candy bar from the vending machine. Everything normal. But when he tried to leave, he discovered that normal had somehow broken. The exit road from the rest area should have taken him back to the highway in less than a minute. Eddie drove down the exit ramp, turned onto what should have been the interstate, and found himself pulling back into the rest area parking lot. He sat there for a moment, confused, thinking he had somehow made a wrong turn, though he could not figure out how that was possible. There was only one exit from the rest area, only one way back to the highway. He tried again more carefully this time, watching every turn, making sure he was going the right direction. But again, after less than a minute of driving, he found himself pulling back into the same parking lot, parking in almost the exact same spot he had left from. Eddie climbed down from his truck and walked to the exit ramp, following it on foot. The ramp curved gently, leading to what looked like the interstate, complete with white lines and mile markers. Eddie could see other vehicles on the road, cars and trucks moving in both directions. He walked back to his truck, climbed in, and tried once more. This time he drove very slowly, paying attention to every detail. He drove down the exit ramp, merged onto the interstate, drove for what he estimated was about 5 miles, confirmed by his odometer. He passed other vehicles, saw landmarks by the side of the road, and then impossibly he was pulling back into the rest area parking lot again, as if the road had formed a loop, as if 5 miles of interstate had somehow bent back on itself and returned him to where he started. Eddie tried calling for help, but his phone showed no signal. He tried his CB radio, but all channels were silent. He got out of his truck and walked to the building, thinking he would find someone who could help, someone who could explain what was happening. Inside, he found 3 other people, 2 truck drivers and a woman in a sedan. They all had the same look on their faces, a mixture of confusion and fear. One of the truck drivers, an older man named Carl, explained that he had been here for 6 hours trying repeatedly to leave, always ending up back in the parking lot. The other driver, a younger man named Jose, said he had been here for 2 days. The woman, whose name was Margaret, claimed she had been here for 3 weeks. Eddie felt his stomach drop. 3 weeks trapped at a rest area, unable to leave, going in circles every time you tried to exit. It sounded impossible, like something from a nightmare, but here he was experiencing it himself. He asked Margaret how she had survived for 3 weeks. She pointed to the vending machines, which she said never ran out of food. Every morning she would check them, and they would be fully stocked again, as if someone had refilled them during the night, though she never saw anyone doing it. The restroom still worked, providing water. She had been sleeping in her car, waiting for something to change, waiting for a way out to appear. The 5 of them sat around one of the picnic tables, comparing their experiences, trying to find a pattern or an explanation. Carl theorized that they had driven into some kind of spatial anomaly, a place where normal geometry did not apply. Jose thought it might be a government experiment, some kind of trap or testing facility. Margaret believed they were being punished for something, though she could not say what or by whom. Eddie did not know what to think. He only knew that he needed to get out, needed to deliver his cargo, needed to get back to his life. They decided to try leaving as a group, thinking that maybe having multiple vehicles would make a difference. They all got into their vehicles and formed a convoy, with Carl leading the way. They drove down the exit ramp together, merged onto the interstate, stayed close together as they drove what should have taken them away from the rest area. But after several miles, the road curved back on itself, and they found themselves pulling into the parking lot once again. All 5 vehicles returning to the same spot where they had started. They tried variations, leaving at different times, taking different speeds, even driving in reverse. Nothing worked. Every attempt ended with them back in the parking lot. Days passed. Eddie lost track of time. His phone claimed it was still Thursday night, the same night he had first arrived, as if time inside the rest area was frozen. But he felt time passing, felt himself growing more tired, more desperate. The vending machines continued to refill themselves every night, providing just enough food to survive, but never quite enough to feel satisfied. Sleep became difficult, plagued by dreams of driving endless loops, never arriving anywhere, just moving in circles forever. The other people became irritable, snapping at each other over small things, the stress of their situation fraying their patience. Then one morning, Eddie woke to find that Margaret was gone. Her car was still there, but she was not in it. Not in the building, not anywhere in the rest area. Carl and Jose had no idea where she had gone. They had all been sleeping, and when they woke, she was simply gone. Carl suggested that maybe she had finally found the way out, but Eddie did not think that was what had happened. There was something about her empty car, its door hanging open, her belongings still scattered in the front seat, that suggested she had not left voluntarily. Jose disappeared 2 days later. Eddie had been talking to him by the picnic tables, had turned away for just a moment to look at something, and when he turned back, Jose was gone. Just vanished as if he had never been there. Carl and Eddie searched the rest area thoroughly but found no trace of him. They checked his truck and found it locked, his keys sitting on the ground beside it. That night, Carl told Eddie that he had a theory. He thought the rest area was taking them one by one, that it was not a trap, but a kind of digestive system, slowly consuming everyone who became stuck here. Eddie wanted to dismiss the theory as paranoia, but he could not. It made as much sense as anything else in this impossible situation. Eddie and Carl stuck close together after that, neither willing to let the other out of sight. They tried to stay awake as much as possible, drinking coffee from the vending machines, slapping each other when one started to doze. But exhaustion eventually won. Eddie woke from an unintended nap to find himself alone. Carl's truck was there, but Carl was gone. Eddie searched frantically, calling Carl's name, checking every corner of the rest area. But Carl had vanished just like the others, leaving no trace, no clue about where he had gone or what had taken him. Eddie was alone now, the only person left at the rest area. He sat in his truck, all the doors locked, trying to think of what to do. He could not stay awake forever. Eventually he would sleep, and whatever had taken the others would come for him. He thought about just giving up, just letting it happen. But some stubborn part of him refused to accept that. He had a load to deliver, people depending on him, a life to get back to. He could not just disappear without a fight. That night, Eddie tried something different. Instead of trying to leave via the exit ramp, he drove his truck straight across the grass, away from the roads, away from any established path. His truck bounced and swayed over the uneven ground, and he gritted his teeth, hoping he would not break an axle. He drove for what felt like miles across open prairie, the rest area lights growing smaller behind him. He thought maybe this would work. Maybe he could escape by simply refusing to use the roads that looped back. But gradually, impossibly, the grass began to change back into pavement, and he found himself driving on a road again, and that road curved around, and ahead he could see the familiar lights of the rest area coming into view. He was back where he started, though this time he approached from a direction that should not have existed. Eddie parked his truck and sat there defeated. There was no way out. The rest area was not just a place. It was a kind of pocket dimension, a space that folded back on itself, that contained everything and allowed nothing to leave. He was going to disappear like the others, and no one would ever know what happened to him. His truck would probably vanish too, erased from existence, and his family would spend years wondering where he had gone, wondering if he had run away or died or simply decided to leave his old life behind. He is still there as far as we know. Sometimes other drivers report stopping at a rest area in Kansas and seeing a truck parked there that looks like it has been there for a very long time, covered in dust, clearly abandoned. Sometimes they report seeing a figure inside the truck, a man who stares out at them with desperate eyes, who mouths words they cannot hear, who seems to be trying to warn them about something, but when they approach the truck to investigate, they find it empty, or they find themselves suddenly back on the highway without remembering how they got there. The rest area remains a trap waiting for travelers, a place where the normal rules of space and time do not apply, where the roads loop back on themselves forever, where people disappear one by one until they are all gone, consumed by whatever presence inhabits that impossible place. And Eddie waits there still, hoping that someday someone will figure out how to escape, hoping that someday the roads will straighten out and allow him to leave, hoping but not really believing, because he has been hoping for a very long time now and nothing has changed, and he suspects nothing ever will. Story 9. The Voice on Channel 19. Brenda had been using CB radio since she started trucking, long before the days of cell phones and GPS, back when the radio was the primary way drivers communicated with each other on the road. She still used Channel 19, the main trucker channel, out of habit and nostalgia. Most of the younger drivers used their phones now, but there was something comforting about the old CB, about the crackle of static and the familiar voices of other drivers sharing information about traffic and weather and speed traps. On a cold February night, driving through Montana with nothing but darkness and snow on all sides, Brenda was grateful for those voices, for the reminder that she was not alone on these empty roads. She was listening to two drivers discuss road conditions ahead when another voice broke into the conversation. This voice was different, quieter, harder to hear beneath the static. It sounded like a woman, though the distortion made it difficult to be certain. The voice was calling for help, saying that she was lost, that she could not find the highway, that she needed someone to guide her. Brenda picked up her microphone and asked the woman for her location, for any landmarks or mile markers she could see. There was a long pause filled with static, and then the woman said that she could not see anything, that there was only darkness and snow, that she had been driving for hours without seeing another vehicle or any signs of civilization. Brenda asked for the woman's handle, her identification on the radio. The woman said her handle was Nightbird, and that she drove a blue Freightliner, that she had been making a delivery to Billings when she had taken a wrong turn somewhere. Brenda checked her GPS and her map, trying to figure out where Nightbird might be. The other drivers on the channel chimed in, offering suggestions, trying to help. But Nightbird's descriptions did not match any road they knew. She talked about driving on a narrow highway with no lights, no other traffic, no buildings or towns, just endless snow-covered fields on both sides. She said her fuel gauge was showing empty, that her truck would die soon, that she was terrified of being stranded in the middle of nowhere in a blizzard. Brenda told Nightbird to stay calm, to keep driving until she found something recognizable, to stay on the radio so they could keep in contact. The other drivers continued to offer advice and encouragement. They spent the next hour trying to help Nightbird, asking her questions, trying to narrow down her location. But nothing she said made sense. She talked about landmarks that did not exist, about roads that were not on any map, about mile markers with numbers that went higher than any real mile markers went. And all the while her voice was fading, becoming harder to hear, as if she was driving away from them, moving into some distant place beyond the range of their radios. Finally, Brenda asked Nightbird a direct question. When did she start driving tonight? What time did she leave on her delivery? There was a long pause, and when Nightbird answered, her voice was barely a whisper. She said she had left on a Tuesday morning in December, that she thought it had been about 6 hours ago, though she was not sure anymore. Brenda felt a chill run through her. Tonight was Thursday, February 10th. If Nightbird had left on a Tuesday in December, she had been driving for more than 2 months, though she seemed to believe it had only been hours. Time was passing differently for her, or she was confused, or something very strange was happening. Brenda asked which December, which year. The silence that followed was longer this time, and when Nightbird spoke again, her voice was different, tinged with fear and confusion. She said it was December of 1998, that she was heading to Billings with a load of furniture. Brenda's hands tightened on her steering wheel. 1998 was more than 25 years ago. She asked Nightbird to describe what her truck looked like, what equipment she had with her. Nightbird's description matched trucks from that era, the style of CB radio, the type of logbook she kept, the lack of GPS or electronic logging devices. She was either an incredibly committed role player, or she really was from 1998. Her voice somehow reaching across more than 2 decades of time. The other drivers on the channel had gone quiet, all of them listening to this impossible conversation. One of them, an older driver named Buck, finally spoke up. He said he remembered hearing about a driver who had disappeared in Montana in the winter of '98. A woman who had been driving a blue Freightliner who had vanished without a trace during a blizzard. Her truck was never found and the case had remained unsolved. Buck asked Nightbird if her real name was Sarah Crawford. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever, and then Nightbird confirmed that yes, her name was Sarah Crawford, and she asked how Buck knew that. Asked who these people were who seemed to know so much about her. Brenda did not know what to say. How do you tell someone that they have been missing for 25 years? That they are presumed dead? That they are somehow broadcasting from the past or from some space between past and present? She tried to explain as gently as she could that something had happened to Sarah, that she had gotten lost not just in space but in time, that the year was now 2024. Sarah's voice became panicked, insisting that this was impossible, that Brenda was lying or confused. But Brenda persisted, sharing details about the world that Sarah could verify, asking her questions about 1998 that she could answer, slowly convincing her that what Brenda was saying was true. Sarah began to cry, her voice breaking up over the radio. She said that she had known something was wrong, that the darkness and the snow had felt unnatural, that time had seemed to move strangely. She said that she could see lights now, far in the distance, and that she was going to drive toward them, that maybe those lights would lead her back to the real world, back to her own time. Brenda begged her not to, warned her that those lights might not be safe, that they might be what was trapping her in this place. But Sarah said she had no choice, that her fuel was almost gone, that she would die if she stayed lost in this darkness. The other drivers tried to convince Sarah to stay on the radio, to keep talking to them while they figured out what to do. But Sarah's voice was fading, the static growing worse, as if she was moving away from them at an incredible speed. She said she could see the lights more clearly now, that they were beautiful, that they looked like stars or distant cities. She said she was not afraid anymore, that the lights were calling to her, that she wanted to reach them. And then in mid-sentence her voice cut off completely, replaced by empty static. Brenda called out to her, called her name over and over, but there was no response. The other drivers tried their radios too, cycling through channels, searching for any trace of Sarah's voice. But she was gone, vanished as completely as she had appeared. The next day, Brenda reported the incident to the authorities, though she knew they would not believe her. And they did not. They listened politely, took her statement, but their expressions made it clear that they thought she was mistaken or fabricating the story. Buck confirmed everything Brenda said, and so did the other drivers who had been on Channel 19 that night. But the authorities remained skeptical. There was no way to prove it had happened, no recording of the conversation, nothing but the testimony of a handful of truckers who had heard a voice on the radio. But Brenda knows what she heard. She knows that somewhere out there, on roads that exist between moments, on highways that connect different times, Sarah Crawford is still driving, still searching for the way home. And sometimes on cold winter nights when the snow is falling and the roads are empty, Brenda thinks she hears that voice again on Channel 19, faint and distant, calling for help, asking for guidance, trying to find her way back to a world that has long since moved on without her. Brenda always responds, always tries to help, knowing that it probably makes no difference, knowing that Sarah is trapped in a loop of time that cannot be broken. But she responds anyway because Sarah is a fellow driver, because she is lost and alone, because no one should have to wander those dark roads forever without someone trying to help them, even if that help can never quite reach them, even if the distance between them is measured not in miles but in years. Story 10. The Fog That Followed. Leonard had driven through fog before, thousands of times over his 30-year career. Coastal fog, valley fog, morning mist that burned off by noon. He knew how to handle low visibility, how to adjust his speed, how to watch for other vehicles. But the fog that settled around his truck that night in Northern California was different from any fog he had ever experienced. It appeared suddenly, without warning, transforming the clear evening into a white-gray wall that pressed against his windshield. Leonard slowed down, flipped on his fog lights, and continued driving at a cautious pace. The fog was thick, reducing visibility to just a few feet, but he had been through worse. He would just drive slowly and carefully until he reached the next town or until the fog lifted. But the fog did not lift. Miles passed, and the fog remained exactly as thick as it had been, neither improving nor worsening. Leonard checked his GPS and saw that he was still on Highway 101, that there were towns ahead, that he should be reaching civilization soon, but the road around him showed no signs of human presence. No other vehicles, no lights, no buildings, just the highway disappearing into the white fog ahead and behind. His headlights seemed to be absorbed by the fog, illuminating only a few feet of pavement before being swallowed up completely. Even his truck's shadow was strange, seeming to move independently, seeming to shift and change shape in ways that shadows should not move. Leonard tried his radio, but all he heard was static. His cell phone showed no signal. His GPS continued to function, showing his position on the highway, but the map around him appeared blank, as if the landscape itself had ceased to exist, replaced entirely by fog. He drove for what felt like hours, watching his odometer tick upward, watching the GPS show him moving along the highway, but never seeing anything except fog. No mile markers, no road signs, no landmarks of any kind. Just the endless white-gray wall pressing in from all sides. Then he noticed something in his rear-view mirror. There was a shape in the fog behind him, keeping pace with his truck. At first he thought it might be another vehicle, but the shape was wrong. Too tall and too narrow to be a car or truck. It looked almost like a person. A figure standing upright, but it was impossibly tall, at least 10 feet high, maybe taller. Leonard told himself it was a trick of the fog, a shadow or a reflection, something his tired mind was misinterpreting. But the figure remained there, constant in his mirror, neither approaching nor falling back, just staying at the same relative distance. Leonard accelerated, and the figure accelerated with him, maintaining its position. He slowed down, and the figure slowed as well. It was following him, deliberately staying just at the edge of his visibility, just far enough back that he could not see it clearly, but close enough that its presence was unmistakable. Leonard felt fear settling into his chest, cold and heavy. He considered stopping, getting out to confront whatever was following him, but every instinct screamed against it. Whatever that thing was, it was not human, not natural, and confronting it seemed like a very bad idea. He drove faster, pushing his truck up to speeds that were dangerous in this fog, hoping to outrun the figure. But no matter how fast he went, the figure kept pace. It never got closer, never fell back, just remained there in his mirror, a constant and menacing presence. Leonard tried to convince himself that it was not real, that he was hallucinating from exhaustion or stress. But the figure looked too solid, too defined to be a hallucination. It was there in the fog, following him for reasons he could not fathom. Hours passed, or maybe days. Leonard lost track of time. His fuel gauge showed full, which made no sense because he had been driving for what felt like half a day. His body felt exhausted, but his truck showed no signs of running out of fuel. The fog never changed, never lifted, never even thinned, and the figure in his mirror never left. Sometimes it would shift position, moving from directly behind him to the left lane or the right lane, but always staying at that same distance, always watching. Leonard began to notice other things in the fog, shapes that might have been buildings or trees, but that did not look quite right, that had geometries that seemed wrong, sounds that came from no identifiable source, low rumbles and high-pitched whistles and rhythmic clicking noises. The road beneath his tires felt different, as if the pavement had changed texture, become softer or rougher. though he could not see it through the fog. He wondered if he was still on Highway 101, or if the fog had somehow carried him onto a different road, a road that did not exist on any map. The figure began to change. Leonard saw it growing taller, its shape becoming more defined. It had arms long and thin, hanging down past where its knees should have been. It had a head, but the head was wrong, too large, shaped like an elongated egg. Sometimes the figure would lean forward, and Leonard could see more details, could see what might have been eyes, dark spots on the pale surface of its head, could see what might have been a mouth, a vertical slit that opened and closed slowly. The figure was not human, not even close, and seeing it more clearly made Leonard's fear spike into terror. He tried everything he could think of to escape. He turned off his headlights, hoping the figure would lose track of him in the darkness, but it made no difference. He tried driving in reverse, but the figure simply repositioned itself to stay in his view. He tried stopping his truck and hiding in the sleeper berth. But when he looked out through the curtains, he could see the figure standing beside his truck, tall and motionless, its head level with his window, so close he could have reached out and touched it if the window had been open. Leonard did not open the window. He sat frozen in terror, staring at the figure, watching him. After what might have been hours, the figure moved away, resuming its position behind the truck, and Leonard scrambled back to the driver's seat and resumed driving, because sitting still seemed even worse than moving. Eventually, Leonard noticed that the fog was beginning to thin. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, but gradually he could see farther ahead, could make out more details of the road and the landscape. Relief flooded through him. He was escaping somehow, leaving the fog and that terrible figure behind. He accelerated, eager to reach clear air, eager to see the sun again, eager to find other people and proof that the real world still existed. The fog continued to thin, becoming mist, becoming haze, and then finally clearing completely. Leonard found himself on a normal highway, with normal traffic, with signs indicating that he was indeed on Highway 101 approaching a town. He pulled over at the first gas station he found, even though his gauge showed full. He needed to stop, needed to calm down, needed to convince himself that he was safe. He parked and sat in his cab, his hands shaking, his heart pounding. He looked at his clock and saw that only 3 hours had passed since the fog had first appeared, though it had felt like days. He climbed down from his cab and looked at his trailer, checking to make sure everything was normal. And there, in the dust on the side of his trailer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There was a handprint, if it could be called that, pressed into the dust. But it was not a human handprint. It was too large, with too many fingers, each finger too long and ending in points. The figure had touched his trailer, had left its mark, proof that it was real, that everything he had experienced had actually happened. Leonard cleaned off the handprint quickly, not wanting anyone to see it, not wanting to have to explain it. He got back in his truck and drove away from that town as fast as he could, eager to put distance between himself and the place where the fog had found him. But he knows the fog will find him again. He has seen it since, appearing on the horizon, rolling toward him, and each time he drives in a different direction, takes a different route, does anything he can to avoid it. But he cannot avoid it forever. The fog knows where he is, knows his truck, knows him, and the figure in the fog is waiting for him, following him, biding its time. Someday the fog will catch him, will surround him completely, and when it does, Leonard knows he will not escape. The figure will finally reach him, will finally touch him with those 2 long fingers, and he will join it in that space between worlds, in that endless gray fog where the roads go on forever, and nothing is real except the terror and the presence of things that should not exist. He drives now with constant fear, checking his mirrors obsessively, watching for the first signs of fog. And on nights when the weather report calls for fog, Leonard refuses to drive at all, parking his truck and locking himself in his sleeper, hoping that somehow, by staying still, he can avoid his fate a little longer. Story 11. The Passenger Seat. Monica never picked up hitchhikers, and she never allowed passengers in her truck. It was a strict rule, one she had maintained throughout her entire career. Her truck was her space, her sanctuary, and she preferred to keep it that way. But when she woke up one morning in a truck stop in Louisiana, she found someone sitting in her passenger seat. A man, middle-aged, wearing clothes that looked outdated, his hair slicked back in a style from decades ago. Monica had definitely locked her doors the night before. She always did. There was no way anyone should have been able to enter her cab. Yet there he was, sitting calmly in her passenger seat, looking straight ahead through the windshield, not acknowledging her presence. Monica demanded to know who he was and how he had gotten into her truck. The man did not respond, did not even look at her, just continued staring forward. Monica grabbed her phone to call the police, but the man spoke then, his voice quiet and measured. He told her not to bother, that the police could not help her, that he would be gone soon enough. He said his name was Thomas and that he had been a truck driver once long ago before everything went wrong. Monica kept her phone in her hand, ready to dial, but something about the man's voice made her pause. He sounded sad, resigned, not threatening. She asked him again how he had gotten into her truck. Thomas turned to look at her then, and Monica saw that his eyes were empty. Not literally empty, but void of life, like looking at a photograph instead of a living person. Thomas explained that he died on this stretch of highway 40 years ago, that his truck had broken down and he had been walking to get help when he was struck by another vehicle. The driver had not stopped, had left Thomas bleeding on the side of the road where he had died alone in the darkness. Since then, Thomas said, he had been trapped here, appearing in trucks, riding with drivers, trying to reach a destination he could never quite arrive at. He said he did not choose which trucks to appear in, that he simply found himself in them, that he was sorry for frightening her, but he had no control over it. Monica told him this was impossible, that ghosts were not real, that there had to be another explanation. But even as she spoke, she knew she was looking at something inexplicable. Thomas was there in her passenger seat, solid and real, but also somehow not quite present, as if he was only partially connected to her reality. She could see through him slightly, could see the dashboard behind him, could see the morning light passing through his body as if he was made of smoky glass. Thomas said he knew she would not believe him, that no one ever believed him, but that it did not matter because he would be gone soon. He always disappeared when the truck started moving, he said, ejected from the cab by some force he did not understand, sent back to wherever it was that he existed between his appearances. Against her better judgment, Monica asked Thomas where he was trying to go. He said he was trying to get to Mobile, Alabama, where his wife and daughter had lived, where he hoped they might still be, though he knew that 40 years had passed and they were probably gone. He said he had been trying to reach Mobile for decades, had ridden in hundreds of trucks, but he never made it. Something always stopped him, ejected him from the vehicle, sent him back to that spot on the highway where he had died. Monica felt sympathy for this strange figure, this lost soul who could not rest, who could not reach the destination he sought. She made a decision that surprised her. She told Thomas that she was heading to Mobile, that she would take him there, that maybe if she deliberately brought him, he would be able to complete his journey. Thomas looked at her with surprise and something that might have been hope. He warned her that it might not work, that he had tried this before with drivers who had offered to help and it had always failed. But Monica was determined. She started her truck and pulled out of the parking lot, and Thomas remained in the passenger seat, still there, still solid. They drove onto the highway, and with each mile that passed, Monica felt a growing sense of accomplishment. Thomas was still there, still riding with her, not disappearing as he usually did. He watched the landscape passing outside the window, and occasionally he would comment on things, noting what had changed and what remained the same since his time. They drove through the morning and into the afternoon, following I-10 toward Mobile. Thomas told her about his life, about his wife Catherine and his daughter Emma, about the runs he used to make, about the truck he had driven, about the night he died. His stories were filled with small details that seemed authentic. verifiable facts that Monica could not imagine him fabricating. He described businesses and landmarks that no longer existed, recalled prices and events from 40 years ago with perfect clarity. Monica found herself believing him completely, accepting that she was somehow helping a ghost reach his final destination. As they approached Mobile, Thomas began to fade. It happened gradually, his form becoming more transparent, more insubstantial. He noticed it too, and panic crossed his face. He said this had happened before, that the closer he got to his destination, the less solid he became, as if something was preventing him from arriving. Monica drove faster, trying to reach the city before Thomas disappeared completely. They crossed the city limits, and Thomas was barely visible now, just a vague outline in the passenger seat. He gave Monica an address, the house where he had lived, where Catherine and Emma had been waiting for him on that last night. Monica found the street, found the house number Thomas had given her. But the house that stood there was not the house Thomas described. It was newer, built in a different style, clearly constructed sometime in the last few decades. Thomas stared at it, his faint form shimmering, and he said that this was wrong, that his house should be here, that he did not understand. Monica got out and knocked on the door. An elderly woman answered, and Monica asked her how long she had lived here. The woman said she had built this house 35 years ago, after buying the lot and tearing down the old house that had been here. Monica asked what had happened to the people who lived in the old house. The woman said she did not know, that the house had been empty for years, that she had bought it from a bank. Monica returned to her truck and found Thomas still there, but fading fast. She told him what the woman had said, and Thomas closed his eyes, tears running down his translucent face. He said that Catherine and Emma were gone, that he had waited too long, that his journey had been meaningless. Monica tried to comfort him, tried to tell him that maybe they were still alive somewhere, that maybe he could find them, but Thomas shook his head. He said he could feel it, that he knew they were gone, that his reason for existing was gone, that there was nothing left for him. And then, before Monica's eyes, Thomas simply ceased to exist. He did not fade away gradually or disappear in a flash of light. He was there, and then he was not, as if he had been erased from reality. The passenger seat was empty. Monica sat in her truck staring at that empty seat, feeling a profound sadness. She had tried to help, had tried to give Thomas what he needed, but it had not been enough. His story ended not with reunion, but with the realization of loss, with the knowledge that everything he had been striving for was already gone. Monica drives past that house sometimes, when her routes take her through Mobile. She always slows down, always looks at the building, always thinks about Thomas. She wonders where he is now, whether he still appears in other trucks, still searches for a destination he can never reach, or whether his final disappearance was an end, a release from his decades of wandering. She has never seen him again, has never found him sitting in her passenger seat, but sometimes in the early morning hours, when she is driving through Louisiana on that same stretch of highway where Thomas died, she thinks she sees a figure walking along the shoulder, a man in outdated clothes with his thumb out trying to catch a ride. She never stops, never picks him up, because she knows that some journeys cannot be completed, some destinations cannot be reached, and some passengers carry with them a sadness that no amount of kindness can heal. Story 12. The Endless Way Station. Gary pulled into the way station outside of Oklahoma City, a routine stop he had made countless times before. The lights were on, indicating the station was open and he needed to stop. He guided his truck onto the scale and waited for the signal indicating he could proceed. The process usually took just a few minutes. His truck would be weighed, his paperwork checked remotely, and he would receive a green light allowing him to continue. But today, the light stayed red. Gary waited patiently, figuring there might be a backup or some kind of system issue. After 10 minutes, he called out on his CB, asking if anyone knew what was going on. There was no response. After 15 minutes, Gary decided to get out and investigate. He walked into the way station building, expecting to find inspectors or officials who could tell him what the holdup was. But the building was empty. The lights were on, computers were running, screens displayed information, but there were no people. Gary called out, his voice echoing in the empty office. No one answered. He walked through the building, checking every room, every office. Completely empty. He went back outside and saw that his truck was still sitting on the scale, the red light still glowing. He climbed back into his cab, intending to just drive through to ignore the red light and get back on the highway. But when he started his engine and tried to move forward, his truck would not budge. It was as if the scale had locked his wheels in place, holding him there by some invisible force. Gary tried reversing, but that did not work either. His engine revved, his wheels spun slightly, but the truck remained motionless on the scale. He shut off the engine and sat there, trying to think. This had to be some kind of malfunction, some mechanical issue with the scale. He would call for help, get someone to come fix it. But his phone showed no signal, despite being in the middle of a major city. His CB radio produced only static. He was stranded here, unable to move, unable to call for help, in a way station that should have been staffed but was completely deserted. Hours passed. Gary waited in his truck, watching the highway beyond the way station, seeing other trucks drive past. He waved at them, trying to get their attention, trying to signal that he needed help. But none of them stopped. They either did not see him or chose to ignore him. Continuing on their way without slowing down, Gary wondered why the way station lights were not directing them to stop. Why he seemed to be the only truck that had been caught here. As the sun began to set, Gary decided to walk to the highway to try to flag down a truck or car to get someone to help him. But when he walked toward the highway, he found that he could not reach it. The distance between the way station and the highway seemed to stretch, expanding as he walked, so that no matter how far he went, the highway remained just out of reach. He turned back and found himself instantly at the way station again, as if the distance collapsed when he was moving toward it instead of away from it. Gary tried several more times, tried walking in different directions, tried running, but the result was always the same. He could not leave the way station. He was trapped here in this space that should have been just a brief stop, held by forces he did not understand. Night fell, and the way station lights glowed brighter, illuminating the empty parking area and his motionless truck. Gary tried to sleep in his cab, but he found sleep impossible. The silence was too complete, too absolute. There were no sounds of traffic, no sounds of nature, not even the sound of wind. Just perfect, oppressive silence. The next morning, Gary woke to find that nothing had changed. His truck was still on the scale, the red light still glowing, the building still empty. He checked his phone and saw that the date had not changed. It still showed the same day as yesterday, as if time itself had stopped. But Gary felt time passing, felt hunger and thirst, felt his body growing stiff from inactivity. He searched the building more thoroughly and found a break room with a refrigerator stocked with food and drinks. He helped himself, grateful for sustenance, but disturbed by how convenient it was, as if this place had been prepared to hold him here for an extended period. Days passed, or what felt like days. Gary established a routine, eating meals from the break room, exercising to keep his strength up, trying repeatedly to escape and always failing. He found that the food in the refrigerator never ran out. Every morning it would be fully stocked again, as if someone was refilling it while he slept, though he never saw or heard anyone. He began to explore the way station more carefully, looking for clues, looking for any indication of what was happening or why. He found records in the office, logbooks showing trucks that had been weighed here, but the dates on the logbooks made no sense. Some were from the future, dates that had not yet occurred. Some were from decades ago. Some used date formats that did not correspond to any calendar system Gary knew. In one drawer, Gary found photographs. They showed the way station at different times, but the building looked different in each photo. Sometimes older, sometimes more modern, sometimes barely recognizable, And in several of the photos, Gary saw trucks parked on the scales, and he saw drivers standing beside their trucks, looking confused and frightened. He wondered if these were other people who had been trapped here, other drivers who had pulled into this way station and found themselves unable to leave. He wondered what had happened to them, whether they had eventually escaped or whether they were still here somewhere, trapped in different versions of this same space. Gary began to notice other strange things. Sometimes he would see his truck from an angle that should have been impossible, as if he was looking down on it from above, even though he was standing on the ground. Sometimes he would walk into the building and find that the rooms were arranged differently than they had been before, with doors leading to places he had not seen previously. Sometimes he would look out the window and see the highway filled with traffic, and other times the highway would be completely empty, as if it had been abandoned for years. The way station existed in multiple states simultaneously, Gary realized, flickering between different versions of itself, different points in time or different realities. He tried to use this instability to escape. He waited until the building seemed to shift, until the doors rearranged themselves, and then he ran, trying to find an exit that might lead him back to the normal world. But no matter which door he chose, no matter which version of the building he found himself in, he always ended up back in the main office, standing in front of the window that looked out at his truck on the scale. The way station was a maze, a trap, a prison that reconfigured itself to prevent escape. Gary began to despair, began to believe that he would never leave this place, that he would spend the rest of his existence trapped in this liminal space between highway and destination. Then one day, or night or whatever time it was, Gary found another person. He walked into the break room and saw a woman sitting at the table eating a sandwich. She looked up as he entered, and her expression was one of resignation rather than surprise. She introduced herself as Linda, said she had been a truck driver too, said she had pulled into this way station 6 months ago and had not been able to leave. She said there were others as well, other drivers trapped in different versions of the way station, occasionally overlapping with each other, occasionally able to communicate across the boundaries that separated them. She said that time worked differently here, that 6 months for her might have been years or decades in the outside world, or it might have been just minutes. There was no way to know. Linda told Gary that she had learned some things about the way station, about how it worked and what it wanted. She said it was not a place, not exactly, but more like a process, a function, a piece of machinery designed to measure and sort and categorize. Trucks were supposed to pass through quickly, to be weighed and evaluated and sent on their way. But sometimes something went wrong. Some error occurred in the measurement or the categorization, and the truck would get stuck, held in the way station while the system tried endlessly to process it, tried to determine where it should go or what it should be, and the driver would be stuck too, trapped along with their truck, held in this space until the error resolved itself, which sometimes took minutes and sometimes took forever. Gary asked if there was any way to fix the error, to force the system to release them. Linda said she had tried everything she could think of, but nothing had worked. The way station was not intelligent, not conscious, just a mechanism running according to rules that made no sense to human understanding. They were like insects caught in a machine, unable to communicate with the machine, unable to make it understand their plight. All they could do was wait and hope that eventually the system would finish its processing and release them. Some drivers had escaped, Linda said. She had seen them disappear, their trucks vanishing from the scales, the red lights finally turning green. But there was no pattern to it, no way to predict who would be released and when. Gary and Linda spent time together when the versions of the way station they inhabited aligned enough to allow it. They shared meals, shared stories, shared their fear and frustration, but most of the time Gary was alone, the building empty again, Linda existing in some parallel version of the space that he could not access. He continued his routine, continued waiting, continued hoping. He stopped counting days, stopped trying to track time because it seemed meaningless here. He simply existed, moment to moment, trapped in an eternal present where nothing changed and nothing progressed. And he is still there as far as anyone knows. Still sitting in his truck on that scale, still watching the red light glow, still waiting for the signal that he can proceed. Other drivers sometimes report seeing a truck on the scale at a certain way station outside Oklahoma City. A truck that has been there as long as anyone can remember, but when they investigate, they find the scale empty. Gary has become part of the way station now, another ghost in its machinery, another error that the system cannot resolve. And somewhere, in another version of that same space, Linda waits too, and the other drivers whose names Gary never learned, all of them held in place by a mechanism that was never designed to hold anything for more than a few minutes. But that has become their permanent prison, their home, their entire universe. A way station that never releases its cargo, a scale that never balances, a red light that never turns green. Story 13. The Black Ice. Trent was experienced enough to know that black ice was one of the most dangerous hazards a trucker could face. Ice on the road that was nearly invisible, that formed without warning on cold nights, that could send even the most careful driver skidding out of control. He had driven through plenty of winter weather, had handled his share of icy roads, had the training and the experience to recognize the conditions when black ice might form. So when he was driving through Wyoming on a clear February night, with temperatures hovering just at freezing, he was alert and cautious, watching for any signs of ice, ready to slow down at the first indication of danger. But the black ice he encountered that night was not like any ice he had seen before. It appeared suddenly in his headlights, a patch of darkness on the road ahead, so black that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Trent's first thought was that it was an oil spill or some kind of dark liquid on the pavement. But as his headlight swept over it, he realized that the dark patch was not on the road. It was the road, or rather it had replaced the road, a circle of perfect blackness about 20 feet in diameter, so dark that he could not see any details. Within it could not see pavement or lines or any texture at all, just blackness like looking into deep space. Trent hit his brakes immediately, his years of training taking over, his truck beginning to slow. But he was going too fast, had too much weight, too much momentum. His truck entered the black circle, and the moment his front wheels touched that darkness, everything changed. The truck did not skid or slide. It fell. Trent felt his stomach lurch as the front of his truck tipped forward, angling down as if the road ahead had suddenly become a ramp leading into the earth. His headlights illuminated nothing, just pointing down into infinite blackness. Trent fought with the steering wheel, tried to brake harder, but his truck continued to tilt, continued to descend into the dark circle. And then, with a sensation like dropping through a trap door, his entire truck plunged downward. Trent felt weightless for a moment, felt his body lifting slightly from his seat, restrained only by his seatbelt. His truck was falling, dropping through the blackness, and Trent could not see anything, could not tell how far he was falling or what he might hit. He braced himself for impact, for the crash that would surely come, for the moment when his truck would hit ground or water or whatever lay at the bottom of this impossible hole. But the impact never came. His truck just kept falling down and down through perfect darkness for what might have been seconds or hours. Trent lost all sense of time, all sense of direction. He felt like he was falling, but he also felt weightless, as if gravity had become confused about which direction was down. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the falling stopped. Trent's truck was back on solid ground, his wheels touching pavement, his engine still running. But the road he was on now was not the highway he had left. He was in a tunnel, or something, like a tunnel, with smooth black walls rising up on either side and curving overhead to form a ceiling. The walls reflected his headlights oddly, creating strange patterns of light and shadow. Trent drove slowly forward, having no other option, hoping that the tunnel would lead him back to the surface, back to the normal world. But the tunnel just continued straight and level, no curves, no intersections, no exits. Just smooth black walls and the road beneath his wheels, stretching ahead into darkness. Trent drove for what felt like hours, watching his odometer climb, burning through his fuel, never seeing anything except tunnel. He tried honking his horn, hoping someone would hear, but the sound was swallowed by the walls, producing no echo, just dead silence after each blast. He tried his radio, his phone, but he was not surprised when neither worked. He was somewhere beneath the earth, somewhere outside normal reality, and communication with the surface was impossible. He began to notice markings on the tunnel walls, symbols or writing in a script he did not recognize, glowing faintly with their own light. The symbols seemed to pulse in rhythm, as if they were alive, as if they were trying to communicate something. The tunnel began to change. The walls, which had been smooth and featureless, started to develop textures, patterns that looked almost organic. Trent saw what looked like veins running through the black surface, pulsing with faint light. He saw structures that might have been machines or might have been living things, impossible geometries that made his eyes hurt when he tried to focus on them. The tunnel was not just a passage through the earth. It was something alive, something built or grown according to principles that human minds were not meant to comprehend. Trent felt fear giving way to a kind of awe, a realization that he had stumbled into something vast and ancient, something that existed beneath the surface of the world, hidden from human awareness. He saw other vehicles sometimes, past them sitting abandoned at the side of the tunnel road. Cars and trucks, old and new, some from recognizable eras, and some that looked strange, futuristic or archaic in ways he could not quite define. Each vehicle was empty, their drivers long gone, leaving behind only these shells of metal and plastic. Trent wondered what had happened to those drivers, whether they had walked away searching for exits, whether they had been taken by whatever presence inhabited this place, whether they had simply disappeared like smoke in wind. He did not stop to investigate the vehicles, did not want to leave his own truck, did not want to become another empty vehicle left beside this impossible road. The tunnel began to slope downward, gradually at first and then more steeply. Trent downshifted, using his engine brake to control his speed, not wanting to accelerate too much, not knowing what lay ahead. The walls began to glow brighter, and Trent realized he could see vast spaces beyond them, huge caverns or chambers that his headlights could not fully illuminate. He saw shapes moving in those spaces, things that might have been alive, large and slow-moving, their forms indistinct and ever-shifting. He kept his eyes on the road, trying not to look at those shapes, trying not to think about what they might be. Finally, after what might have been days of driving, Trent saw light ahead. Not the artificial light of his headlights reflected back, but real light, white and bright, like sunlight. He accelerated toward it, hope surging through him. The tunnel was ending, leading him back to the surface, back to the world he knew. He burst out of the tunnel into brilliant light, and for a moment he was blinded, unable to see anything. When his vision cleared, he found himself on a highway, a normal highway with normal traffic and normal scenery. He pulled over to the shoulder and sat there shaking, trying to process what had happened. He checked his GPS and found that he was in Nevada, hundreds of miles from where he had been when he entered the black circle. His odometer showed that he had driven nearly 1,000 miles through that tunnel, though his fuel gauge showed he should have run out of gas hours ago. Trent got out of his truck and looked back at the road behind him, looking for the tunnel entrance, looking for any sign of where he had come from. But there was nothing, just normal highway stretching into the distance. The tunnel was gone, or it had never been visible from this side, or it existed in some space that only opened from within. Trent climbed back into his truck and drove to the nearest town, where he parked and tried to figure out what to do. He could not report this, could not tell anyone about the tunnel, because they would think he was crazy. He had no proof. Nothing to show that he had not simply driven from Wyoming to Nevada on normal roads. But Trent knows what he experienced. He knows that beneath the surface of the world, there are passages and spaces that were not made by humans, that were not made for humans, that exist according to rules that defy all understanding. He knows that the black ice was a door, an entrance into that hidden world, and he knows that there are other doors, other black circles appearing on roads around the country, waiting for unsuspecting drivers. He watches for them now, watches for any patch of darkness that looks too dark, any section of road that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. And when he sees other trucks on the highway, he wonders how many of their drivers have experienced something similar, how many have driven through that impossible tunnel, how many carry with them the knowledge that the world has depths and dimensions that maps do not show, and science cannot explain. He tells himself that he was lucky, that he made it through and back to the surface, that most drivers probably do not survive the journey. But sometimes late at night, he wonders if he really did make it back, or if he is still in that tunnel somehow, still driving through endless darkness. And this world he thinks he returned to is just another level of the dream, another layer of the labyrinth that exists beneath the black ice. Story 14. The Repeating Town. Carl had driven through the town of Millbrook dozens of times. It was a small place in rural Montana, just a few streets and a handful of businesses, the kind of town that existed mainly as a place for trucks to refuel and travelers to grab a quick meal. Carl knew Millbrook well enough to navigate it without thinking, knew which gas station had the cleanest restrooms, knew which diner served the best coffee. So when he drove through Millbrook one Tuesday afternoon, he was not paying much attention, just following his usual route through town, heading for the gas station on the far side. But something felt different today. Carl could not quite identify what had changed, but his instincts told him that something was off, that Millbrook was not quite the same town he remembered. He pulled into the gas station and got out to pump his fuel. The attendant who usually worked here was not present, replaced by a younger man Carl did not recognize. Carl asked where Joe was, the regular attendant, and the young man looked confused, said there was no one named Joe working here, said he had been the only attendant at this station for the past 3 years. Carl thought that was strange but did not pursue it. People changed jobs, businesses changed staff, it was not worth worrying about. He finished fueling and went inside to pay, and that was when he noticed the date on the calendar behind the counter. It showed the correct month and day, but the year was wrong. The calendar showed a year from 7 years ago, the same month and day, but 7 years in the past. Carl pointed this out to the attendant, thinking the calendar must be old, must not have been changed. But the attendant looked at the calendar and said it was correct, said today was indeed that date 7 years ago. Carl laughed nervously, thinking this was some kind of joke. He pulled out his phone to show the attendant the correct date, but his phone showed the same date as the calendar. Carl felt a chill run through him. This was not possible. He knew what year it was, knew what date it was, had checked his phone that morning, but his phone now insisted that it was 7 years earlier, and the attendant seemed genuinely confused about why Carl thought this was wrong. Carl paid for his fuel and left the gas station quickly, feeling increasingly unsettled. He drove toward the edge of town, eager to get back on the highway, eager to leave Millbrook behind. But as he reached the town limits, he saw the sign welcoming him to Millbrook, the same sign that should have been at the entrance to town, not the exit. He was entering Millbrook again, driving past the same welcome sign even though he had just driven through the entire town. Carl pulled over and looked around, trying to understand. He had definitely driven through town. He had stopped at the gas station, had driven past all the familiar buildings, but somehow he was back at the beginning, entering Millbrook again as if his drive through town had never happened. He drove through town again, more slowly this time, paying attention to every detail. Everything looked slightly different, subtly wrong. Buildings were painted different colors, or they had different businesses inside them. The diner he knew was now a hardware store. The bank had become a post office. The people on the streets were different people, or they were the same people wearing different clothes, walking with different postures, as if they were different versions of themselves. Carl reached the far side of town and saw the gas station where he had just stopped, but it looked different too, older, with an older style of gas pumps. He did not stop, just kept driving, and again he found himself at the welcome sign, entering Millbrook for a third time. Carl realized with growing horror that he was trapped in a loop, that Millbrook had become a circle, that driving through it just brought him back to the beginning. He tried different strategies. He tried driving fast, trying to break through the loop by momentum. He tried driving backward through town. He tried turning onto side streets, trying to find an exit he had not used before. Nothing worked. Every attempt ended the same way, with him at the welcome sign entering Millbrook again. The town was reconfiguring itself each time he drove through, presenting him with a slightly different version, a slightly different year, a slightly different reality. On his seventh pass through town, Carl stopped and got out of his truck, walking into the diner or hardware store or whatever it was in this version of Millbrook. Inside, he found people eating or shopping or working, all of them acting as if everything was normal. Carl approached the counter and asked the person working there how to leave town, how to get back to the highway. The person looked at him with confusion and said that the highway ran right through town, that all he had to do was keep driving. Carl tried to explain that he had been driving, that he kept ending up back at the beginning, that he was trapped in some kind of loop. But the person just looked at him with concern, suggested that maybe Carl was tired, that maybe he should rest before continuing his journey. Carl left the diner and walked to his truck, trying to think. He was trapped in a town that was looping back on itself, trapped in multiple versions of the same place, unable to escape. He thought about abandoning his truck and walking, trying to leave town on foot, but he suspected that would not work either, that the loop would catch him regardless of how he traveled. He got back in his truck and drove through town again, this time counting the passes, trying to see if there was any pattern or limit. 10 times, 20 times, 50 times he drove through Millbrook, and each time it was different, subtly rearranged, subtly altered. The changes accumulated. Buildings he recognized from earlier passes would disappear, replaced by new buildings. Street layouts would shift. The population would change, sometimes the town seeming busy and crowded, other times nearly deserted. On his 100th pass, Carl noticed that the town was aging, or rather moving backward through time. The buildings looked older. The cars on the streets were from earlier decades. The people wore fashions from the past. Millbrook was regressing, showing him its own history, walking backward through its years. Carl realized that if he kept driving, he might eventually reach a point before Millbrook existed, before there was anything here but empty land. And maybe then the loop would break, maybe then he could escape. He kept driving, watching the town grow younger, watching it shrink, watching it transform from a modern small town to a frontier settlement to a handful of wooden structures to nothing at all. Finally, on what must have been his 200th pass through town, Carl found himself driving on a dirt road through open prairie, with no sign of any buildings or people. The welcome sign was gone. Millbrook had ceased to exist, rewound past the point of its founding. Carl felt relief flood through him. He had escaped, had driven through the loop so many times that he had exhausted it, had reached a version of this place where the town had not yet been built. He accelerated, driving across the empty prairie, following the dirt road that would eventually lead him back to the highway. And then ahead of him, he saw the welcome sign appearing again, brand new and freshly painted, marking the entrance to Millbrook. The town was being born again, starting its cycle over, and Carl was still trapped within it. He has been driving through Millbrook for what feels like years now. Though his body does not age, his truck does not run out of fuel, his and time seems to have no meaning here. He has seen Millbrook in every era of its existence, has met thousands of versions of the people who have lived here over the decades. He knows the town better than anyone has ever known it, knows every building and every street and all their variations. But he cannot leave. He is part of Millbrook now, part of its eternal cycle, another element that repeats with each iteration of the town. Sometimes on certain passes through town, he sees other trucks driving the same route, other drivers with the same confused expressions. And he knows that he is not the only one trapped here, that Millbrook catches travelers and holds them, adding them to its collection, incorporating them into its endless repetition. And Carl drives on, entering town again and again, hoping that someday the loop will break or that he will finally understand what Millbrook wants, what purpose it serves, why it exists in this impossible state. But for now there is only the welcome sign appearing again in his headlights, and the familiar streets stretching ahead, and the knowledge that he will drive through this town forever, trapped in time, trapped in space, trapped in Millbrook, population unknown, visitors infinite, exit zero.